Welcome to Cracking Cancer, where we tackle the tough questions about cancer with real patients and world experts. Our mission is to empower the cancer community through education, bring transparency to the oncology system, and drive funding for critical cancer research. Whether you're facing a diagnosis, supporting a loved one, or simply here to learn, we're here to bring clarity, hope, and action to the fight against cancer. Hey everyone, welcome to Cracking Cancer. I am your host, Dr. Kyle Concannon. I'm a physician scientist at the University of Colorado, and I am joined today by Samantha Murrell and Max Doppelt.
Hey everyone, Samantha Murrell, patient advocate, stage 4 lung cancer with a HER2 mutation. Happy to be here as always. Over to you, Max.
Yeah, thank you, Kyle, for this opportunity, and nice to meet you both. I was introduced to the cancer world, unfortunately, about 2 years ago. My mom was diagnosed with a late-stage non-small cell lung cancer, and while I had no medical background, I was propelled into this caregiver role. And the last 2 years has been an adventure, and thankfully she is doing well today. And I'm excited to be here to discuss clinical trials.
Yeah, no, we're happy to have you come on because I know, Samantha, you've evaluated clinical trials. You've sent me clinical trials that you were potentially a candidate for. And Max, we've been in conversations about how hard it is to find clinical trials. So we really wanted to have a conversation about the perspectives really from both sides about what are clinical trials. We have a separate episode that's about what they are and who should enroll in them and benefits. So, I would recommend going to that episode for more detailed information about clinical trials. And this is really talking about the patient and provider perspective as to what they offer. How do you actually navigate finding one? So I think that's pretty much going to be the focus today. Rather than the nitty gritty of how they're designed and things like that. But, maybe kicking us off, Max, you had spoken about a couple years ago, 2 years ago, kind of being thrown into this mix of being a caregiver and trying to figure out how do I support my mother? How do I get the best care for her? And part of that is, sometimes the clinical trial. So I'm curious what your initial thoughts were about enrolling in a clinical trial. What were your perceptions of clinical trials? And, how did you proceed knowing what you know?
It's really morphed over time. I think the first exposure was when my mom was first diagnosed. She got her NGS testing to determine the molecular profile of her tumor. And she has an EGFR exon 20 mutation, which EGFR was all over Google and had great results with Tagrisso. So I understood that these novel drugs could have a huge impact. But for exon 20, her specific mutation, in the report, there were actually listed a number of clinical trials that were ongoing. And this was a Foundation Medicine report. And it seemed very experimental. My mom, she's getting treated at MSK. And at that time, they were not recommending any clinical trials. So we really just dove right into the initial treatment of chemo plus an immunotherapy, hoping to get to surgery. And so at first it was experimental. Then when her disease progressed and it metastasized to her brain, there was no standard of care available. So really clinical trials, I viewed at that point in time, this was now a year ago, was her only option.
And what were your perception of clinical trials? Like, what did you expect they would be like?
I have an engineering background, so very much was looking at clinical trials from a data lens and looking at statistics like progression-free survival and overall survival and certain grade toxicities. How likely are you to have symptoms on the clinical trial? And when I found these third-generation TKIs for exon 20, I was amazed how much better patient experiences there were than the standard of care, which would just have been chemotherapy. So it was really a source of light, finding these clinical trials. And then almost that source of light became a nightmare because it meant navigating and actually getting onto a clinical trial.
Yeah, and I guess to paraphrase for individuals listening who may not be in the lung sphere and do not use TKIs and things like that, your mother was in a position where if you scoured the literature and you looked at the data and you looked at stuff from conferences, you could see that there were things out there that worked pretty well, but they're not yet approved. So it's like, how do I get these things? And I see that they're available in clinical trials, which may or may not be where you live, but that's the way to get them. And that's the only way to get them sometimes. And then if you don't have them, the discrepancy between these really good responses that you're seeing in a trial from some sort of meeting and standard of care, that can be a pretty wide difference, particularly for something rare like your mother had or has. So there's a strong need to look into clinical trials. How can we get this thing that seems really promising? And then Pandora's box opens of the logistical nightmare that is trying to find clinical trial that's right for you. But maybe over to Samantha, you've also been in this position. You have a HER2 mutation, not the same as EGFR, but a similar premise. You're
exon 20 crew, though.
Yeah. Your tumor is driven by a specific thing that we could potentially target, and that itself has trials based around it. Mm-hmm. So what's been your experience looking for trials or trying to find the right trial for you?
So when I was first diagnosed, I was actually put on a trial. It was chemotherapy and immunotherapy, regular standard of care, but separating immunotherapy out by a week, so you weren't getting them at the same time. So technically it was a clinical trial, even though it wasn't that, far-fetched. But it was good to be part of because I kind of got firsthand experience of what it was like to be on a clinical trial, like how much blood work they really require, how many scans they really require. And honestly, I really liked it because they were super on it. Not that my team isn't super on it now, but with a clinical trial, they were like really on it and really kind of like very detailed in their meticulous. That was the word I was trying to find. I'm very meticulous in every component of my blood work, every inch of my scan. And I loved that level of detail. And in fact, my scans also, I think, had some kind of priority on them. So they got read within 30 minutes of being done because I was on a clinical trial at my hospital, which was wonderful mentally. So my experience has very much just been local, not having to travel anywhere, but having been on one and experienced that level of detail. I really did enjoy it. I think others might not enjoy that level of being poked and prodded and looked at, but I actually liked it a lot. In the future, I definitely will be on a trial at some point. I will say for me, when I do research about trials, and you've seen this firsthand, Kyle, I'll send you stuff. The problem with HER2 in particular is it's in lots of different cancers. And so you'll see a clinical trial that says HER2, and then you come to find out it's actually for breast cancer or a different type of cancer because I don't read the small print until I send it to you. And so it's kind of disheartening that you get excited about the specific trial and then you realize it's not related to lung cancer. And so that's kind of been my experience so far in terms of searching for trials.
Yeah, and I'll say there's a lot of fine print. This fools us too. And when I'm setting up trials on the clinical side, we have a team of people who know the trial inside and out. And as they're screening patients to say, is this patient a good fit? Is it not? We still have to go through all that fine print. And even when something comes out that is potentially an exclusion criteria, meaning if someone has this, they shouldn't go on the trial. We still have to hem and haw. We contact the trial sponsor. So it's not clear to anybody for many of these trials that someone is or isn't necessarily a candidate. But the sooner you have that information, definitely the easier. For example, you gave me a trial and said, hey, this seems really promising. And I had to look through and say, oh no, this is looking at HER2 protein level, not HER2 mutations. Mm-hmm. And if you didn't have that screening element of your concierge doctor, but no, if you didn't run it by me real quick, then most people are just going to go to that institution. They have their visit and they say, oh no, that's a trial in hepatobiliary. That's not even in your disease type. And you're like, well, I just flew across the country. And, so I think it's challenging. I'm happy we're talking about it, but the frustrations are on all sides. I'll say I'm stumbling over my words now too. From a provider perspective, it's really hard to have a visit with someone who comes there for a trial, and the second that you walk in the door, they're not a candidate for it. That happens to us too. Or you hope that they're a candidate for it, and then you talk to them, and there's just an immediate screen out, and you just have to say, sorry, you're not a candidate for this trial. There's nothing else I can offer you. You have to go back home. So it's hard on all folks. But maybe, we can start off by just giving a general overview of the different types of trials. And I'm talking about phases, because I think that there's a big difference between those and the level of investment that someone's probably going to have to lean into to join a phase 1, 2, or 3 trial. So in brief overview, the phase 1 trials are usually a first-in-human kind of study where this is something that looked really promising in the laboratory. We want to try it in patients. And this is the first time it's in people. There's a lot of blood draws. There's a lot of monitoring. And people are usually there for quite some time at whatever site. Could be hours in a given day. Sometimes for these trials, you have to stick around there. So they can be really time intensive. And the objective is just to see, is this drug safe? Is this something that we can develop in further trials in a limited dose, high observation, make sure it's doing okay. Then there's phase 2, which asks, does it work? Does it do anything? Is it effective? And that, usually has a little bit more of a leash. We understand that it's safe, a little bit less time intensive. And then there's phase 3, which you're usually comparing it to something else to say, we've established that it's safe, we've established that it works, but does it work better than what we're currently doing? Samantha, what you were describing was probably a phase 3 trial. Mm-hmm. They changed a dosing regimen. And even with that, you said there's a lot of monitoring. Mm-hmm. That's probably the least amount of monitoring that our trials have. So once you get to phase 3, that's where things have been developed a little while. We have a good sense it's safe. We have a good sense that it works. But we want to say, is this the best thing for you right now? And depending on where people are at in their treatment and how aggressive people want to be, the level of logistical barriers, any of those phases may make sense to join. But it's just to say that not all trials are the same. But Max, maybe back over to you. What was your first, entryway into identifying a clinical trial for your mom? How did that go?
Well, you touched on the different phases of a clinical trial, and that was a key component in the initial search, because for some phase 3 trials, you have a randomized control arm where the patient would not get the drug, and searching outside of the Memorial Sloan Kettering network, we saw some trials for exon 20 like that. And that's when you're the patient, it's such a challenging experience to think there's this 50% chance you're not getting the novel treatment. And while you are still getting the standard of care, from my perspective as my mom's caregiver, I knew of other trials that were offering maybe in phase 2, where she would be guaranteed the drug. So I really tried to prioritize those trials for her. And it created this very complex puzzle to navigate, because now there are a number of trials that we can consider. Our oncologist at MSK is really only able to help us for the trial that's at MSK. And then as a patient and caregiver, we're responsible for being the quarterback and navigating to other sites and navigating exclusion and inclusion criteria. Is this the right fit, right trial for my mom? That was a really tough process. And ultimately, we failed screening and didn't end up getting onto any clinical trial.
Yeah, that's very disheartening. Because, it sounds like you put a lot of time in combing through different resources to try to find trials. Like, what were you doing? Where were you looking?
So in parallel, I would walk with her to MSK almost every day during screening. So she was getting blood tests, eye exam, cardiac exam. Every day felt like a new milestone that we had to hit in order to get successfully screened through the trial. And then in parallel, in the event we didn't get on, I was also searching for alternative trials in the area. And so it was definitely a challenge just kind of navigating the day to day with my mom. And this is after learning you have this really serious condition and every day matters. So over the course of weeks, it really is cumulative.
What websites did you use?
I was using clinicaltrials.gov, which is very hard to use. And I was trying other vendors as well. They're companies that will help patients search for clinical trials. And I contacted a number of those companies, shared my mom's records. None of them were really successful helping us identify trials or working on the time scale that we needed. So clinicaltrials.gov was a great source of truth. And then actually calling the sites was really the only way to get through. I found that emails always get lost.
Yeah, and I'll say the level of rigor that you went through to go through clinicaltrials.gov, which is also the resource that we use as clinicians. And that is what was submitted to get the trial approved. It has the inclusion criteria. It has the exclusion criteria. Those things mean what are the things that have to be true, the inclusion criteria for someone to be a candidate. And the exclusion criteria are what things have to not be true. For example, if you have a history of really bad lung disease, maybe you wouldn't be allowed on this lung cancer treatment. So they'll say history of really bad lung disease, using medical jargon that most people are not going to understand, of course. And those can get really detailed. For us as clinicians, they can even be overly detailed and confusing. So I think trying to navigate them from the patient perspective, it's tough to imagine that being anything other than incredibly distressing.
That's ultimately why we were excluded from a trial. The term is pneumonitis, or it was risk of pneumonitis. And my mom, she had a breast cancer radiation back in 2014. And the theory was the immunotherapy kind of triggered the radiation, and she had this chronic cough. And what was really tough, and I'm curious as on the provider side, it took them 3 weeks to eventually determine that we failed screening. And it felt like from our perspective, from the patient perspective, we should have found that out much sooner because the CT scan showed the inflammation on day one. So we then went through 3 weeks of additional screening to ultimately find out we were excluded. So I'm curious, what is it like behind the scenes?
Yeah, it's frustrating. I share your frustration. Most of the time when we have a patient that we're trying to put on a trial, we're advocating for the patient to go on the trial. And I think there's a natural balance between the providers and the trial sponsors. The trial sponsors want the cleanest trial they can get. They don't want any biased things. If that lung inflammation really did come back in their trial and then it says, oh, it's due to their trial drug, well, they don't want that in there if it really wasn't due to the trial drug. So I get it. But a lot of times the delay is the clinician saying, I don't think this is relevant. And maybe the trial sponsor is saying, well, maybe you don't think it's relevant, but we see it there, hard to exclude it. The trials do want to include all people that are, reasonable to be in the trial, but they also have to protect the integrity of the data to make sure that it ends up being interpretable. And most of the time, you'll read these inclusion criteria and these exclusion criteria, and they sound really black and white. And a lot of times they're not. I mean, I was on correspondence today about a patient who has a small radiographic abnormality on their MRI. There's like a little white dot. And the radiologist is like, could be a brain metastasis. Not really sure. It's just a tiny, small artifact in there.
Oh,
we see an abnormality
recently.
What's that?
I said, this sounds really familiar because this actually happened to me.
It's going around. No, but this is a common thing. Like you see this small abnormality and it's like, can you say it's not a brain metastasis? And you're like, well, I can't say it's not, but it might be, so you have a couple options. Okay, we talk to them. How concerned are you? I'm not that concerned. We get a follow-up MRI. Did it change anything? Not really, but still Do you just go ahead and radiate whatever that was to get them a trial candidate? Because most trials don't allow people who have brain disease. So a lot of it is this him and hawing back and forth. It's really frustrating because while you're figuring this out, from the provider standpoint, I feel like I'm doing nothing. And it's because I am doing nothing. We're trying to get someone on the trial and we're not changing therapy right now. Because something a lot of other people may not know is if you change therapy to something new, you may no longer be qualifying for the trial. You're on a new drug. Any benefit you saw now could be from the thing I just gave you. It may not be from the study drug. So the hemming and hawing about trying to get people onto a trial when there is any ambiguity in their medical background is really hard. And that takes time. Usually people really are working in the background. There's a lot of emails in the situation I was just mentioning. There's pretty much daily emails escalating to different people, asking different sources. And ultimately it goes to the study sponsor. And then they kind of do that too. They're talking internally about, is this person really a candidate? Should we exclude them? So it's a lot of deliberation. But at the end of the day, it's the trial's call, whether or not they allow someone to enroll and how nervous they are. But the medical team is usually advocating for enrollment if they think it's reasonable. And in the case of, say, your mom, Max, where they had some pneumonitis back in the day, inflammation of the lungs, that was probably from radiation. I could see an oncologist saying, I don't think this was from medication. They got radiation there. And I could see myself arguing for that. And that may take some time. And eventually it sounds like they were not successful in arguing for that, which is also, in my experience, how these things go. The trial sponsors are usually pretty strict. And if there's ambiguity, they'll err on the side of exclusion to not make the data more biased or not introduce unnecessary harms to the patients they're giving their medicine to. So I get where they're coming from, but it's the inclusion and exclusion criteria are not as clear as they may seem when you're looking at it at clinicaltrials.gov or wherever else you may go.
I was going to ask, so for out-of-state drug trials, I don't know if, Max, you explored those, but those ones seem like such a headache to me. Like, really, I'm going to get on a plane or whatever and fly and go through all of this. But I'm curious, when it comes to like applying for those, do they actually require you to fly out and get all of these tests done? Like, can you not get tests done locally to kind of prove that you're eligible, or do you have to go to the team?
So that answer is probably institution specific.
Gotcha.
I'll say for most institutions, the things that are objective measures, like is there or not brain disease, are the white blood cell counts high enough? Mm-hmm. Is the person anemic or not? Those things can usually transfer across institutions okay.
Gotcha.
To the discretion of the provider. For me, I'm usually pretty fine letting those things come across as long as it's from, a reasonable site. And I've yet to come across something that I thought was unreasonable. So yeah, those things can travel. I'll say you still need to see that provider to determine if you're eligible or not, because not all of screening is those subjective or those objective things. Some of it's subjective. If all your lab work looks great and your CAT scan looks great and your MRI, well, if your CAT scan looks like it needs to be enrolled in the trial.
Yes, tracking.
And your MRI is negative for disease, and then they wheel you in on a gurney, you're probably still not going to be a trial candidate if you're too fatigued, if those things matter a lot too. Mm-hmm. So no one can say you're definitely a trial candidate. Now, that being said, for many of these objective data, you can tell ahead of time if you meet these things or not. Although a given institution may not do full screening until you get there.
Gotcha.
And Max, I think you have a lot to add here from your experience trying to find trials in different places. And
yeah, I think from a couple angles. First, what Samantha said about this notion of pre-screening. What I've done for my mom and what I'm currently doing for other patients through patient advocacy is taking my mom's medical records, so the full EHR, and when I look at a clinical trial, I try and do a pre-screening to see, is there any chance that the criteria, and given what scans and blood work she already has, what is her risk of missing out on the trial? Because I imagine there is a large percent of patients who will travel to great lengths and then ultimately fail screening. And that seems avoidable in a lot of cases. Like Kyle said, probably not all cases, or maybe, but even if it's half, that's a huge impact. And then personally with my mom, there really is a happy ending here, because we ultimately were able to navigate this really nightmare of a scenario of not gaining access to a clinical trial near us in New York. I was actually at a conference in Huntington Beach, which is coming up again, targeted therapies conference, just searching for answers. I was actually at the conference trying to speak to the trial coordinator and plead to her that she should let my mom onto this trial, which I've learned is not the way to do things. But while I was at the conference, someone made a comment to me, oh, if you were just Chinese and lived in China, you actually could get prescribed sunvosertinib, which is a really exciting third generation TKI for exon 20. And it really hit me. And I said, can you say that again? And it really stuck with me. And over the course of the next week, I called every person I knew and essentially came to the realization the best chance for my mom was to get access to this drug in China. So from my perspective, the barriers to that were, it was a total mountain. I didn't know anyone in China, but I knew that is where we had to get this drug. And over the course of that week, we got connected to a really nice oncologist in China. A cousin of mine had a business partner who was there, who arranged for us to have a translator. And my mom and I at 3 a.m. in the morning are speaking to this oncologist in Shanghai, sharing all of our medical records, just like screaming into the microphone, exon 20. And then eventually after a week, we got her this drug, sunvosertinib, and she's been on it for 11 months now and has had a clinical response.
Well, I mean, congratulations to all you went through and clearly reaping the benefits of scientific progress. And how frustrating is it that we have that medicine in the United States in trials that you couldn't get on? You had to go to a different country.
Approved now, and still not available. It got FDA approved in July, and it's still not available to patients in the U.S.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, what you're showing is also our frustration with the regulatory guidelines around clinical trial development, around pharmaceutical development. I'm particularly in a space where we're working on making cellular therapies, which is heavily, heavily regulated. I'm learning more about it every day, about the barriers of infusing things into people and trying to get that to treat the cancer safely. But it's really interesting because different countries have different levels of risk tolerance when it comes to treating individuals with cancer. And how ironic of all places, it's China, our probably primary intellectual competitor in this space. And I think China has also overtaken the United States in publications in cancer. So, we have individuals here, we have institutions where patients from China will come, they come to my institution, they've come to prior institutions to get access to medicines here. But this was one of the first times that I've heard of an individual having to go to China to get something that they could get here if not for regulatory barriers. So I'm curious to hear more, what that experience was like. Not that I want to endorse going out of country for something, but I'm uniquely curious. I haven't talked to someone who's gone through a system in Shanghai to receive a medicine.
So at first it was, and I have not publicly spoken about this until now. It felt like such taboo. And especially when the first time we accessed the drug, we got a 3-month supply. So we had this natural anxiety of, well, are we going to be able to go and get the next batch of the supply? And if everyone remembers, back in March, April of 2025, there was this thing called a trade war, which was who knows what was going to escalate out of that. And my only thought was, I need to make sure that I can, we can travel to Shanghai and get this medication to the United States for my mom. And it's just, so navigating that aspect certainly induced a lot of anxiety, but we had a great network of people and who really cared about my mom. And what's incredible is since that point we referenced about, I was told by a lot of oncologists, this is the first time they heard about a patient getting a drug from China. And since then, I think there have been dozens of other patients that have followed. No organization or no doctor is guiding patients to China, but word gets out.
Of course.
This type of the promise of this drug is obviously very much needed among patients. So the word got out, and I've personally connected with dozens of patients through Facebook groups and just keeping in touch. And it's just amazing kind of the power of a patient community. And I've had some crazy stories of patients who needed to start the drug right away. And your conversation with Dr. Ross Camage, where he had the drug on his desk to start his treatment, I hand delivered someone's first week supply so that they could start the drug right away. And then their son went to China to get it. So it's just created an immense sense of community among patients.
Well, I'm curious, what was the reaction from the American providers? I have my perceptions, but I want to hear your perspective here.
They could not have been more pleased. I feel so thankful to have our oncology teams at MSK and NYU, and by no way did they endorse this but when they found out that we started the medication, and they ultimately said from a health perspective it would be okay, but from once they knew we started and had this supply, they were just amazed, because my mom was able to then, if she were to enroll in a clinical trial, that she had brain metastases, and the trial would want to measure the impact of the drug on her brain mets. But we were able then to get SRS gamma knife radiation. So we kind of got the best of both worlds, where we're getting some standard of care, where we're treating her brain mets, and we're starting this novel therapy that will also target brain mets. So we kind of were able to attack the metastases from two angles, which no trial would have allowed us to do. So from our provider standpoint, they were just so happy.
Yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that your providers were endorsing, and that was going to be my suspicion. I think there's a misconception that the medical industry, the oncology teams, want to make sure you do the things they want you to do. And if it's outside of that landscape, then, it's going to be taboo, as you say it, or people are going to view that negatively. And for the most part, I think the oncology teams want patients to do things that are going to help themselves. And if you're leaving the US to try something we don't think is going to be helpful and is possibly going to be harmful, and many patients do that, and they're the ones that have to navigate the consequences of these really impossible decisions. But that's usually where I see conflict, is where we really think someone's doing something to harm them. But you were in an interesting position where you were using cutting edge data to inform, biopsy-driven decisions, saying, hey, there's this really unique alteration in my mom's tumor. This medicine, we know to be the best thing for it. And the medical teams weren't probably going to deny that fact, but it's just, how can you get it? Can you get it safely? So I think it's a testament that we really do want patients to get the best care. A lot of times it is through clinical trials, which have limitations. And I would agree that it's not always the best care, but it is probably the best way to answer a certain question with the tools we have. And there's a difference there. So you are getting probably the best care. That, from what you're describing, I would agree with that. If they were in a clinical trial, the radiation would definitely confound our ability to say, does it help with brain disease? We wouldn't be able to know that if it got radiated. So it's interesting. I'm really impressed you navigated all that, though. That must have been pretty horrifying, actually, to have to like have the courage to get on a flight to China and like, let's see where this goes.
It was very hard from, navigating the promise of the clinical trial and knowing that the drug was right there, to then it just feeling so far out of reach. And then finally, she went on it. We had to then deal with certain toxicities, which she's received the drug well, but certainly has had symptoms, the classic GI and some nausea, fingernails, skin rash. So we kind of just like entered this new reality. And it's just, we're so thankful for it, because each day that she's able to live her life has just had a profound impact on me and her. So many people depend on her. So it's like one person extending their quality of life has just had this like whole network and kind of tree effect to so many other people.
Samantha, I'm curious to hear your thoughts of that story. What's your initial impression of going to China for a medicine? And
I mean, that's amazing. Everyone should be a Max. I mean, it's fantastic. I think that, to me personally, and what I've seen in this space so far, and I'm sure Max would agree, is networking seems to be the key to have doors open for you. And not everyone is fortunate enough to have the ability to network like that. And so I think it's on us in a way, as Max said, like him helping out other people too, just kind of guiding other people through the process and opening those doors up for other people, who might think it's not possible for them. Because if someone can do it, anyone can do it potentially. You just have to have the right connections and those right doors open for you. So, but I think it's fantastic. And a question I had for you, Kyle, is, I see a lot of times where people won't necessarily be eligible for the clinical trial, but they can sometimes apply for compassionate use of the drug. And so I'm curious if you know a little bit, or maybe Max does too, in terms of the inner workings of that decision. I know some drug companies that say no, some that say yes. Is it case by case? Is it company by company? And what that kind of looks like? Because I want to make it known that sometimes that is a possibility for people, that even if they're not eligible for the trial, they can still try and get the drug.
yeah, and there are creative ways to go about that. The compassionate access use, there's also single patient investigation of new drugs, or SPINDs. And those are potential ways that an individual patient can get access to something that's not currently approved. Now, usually when we do those things, they still have to meet certain criteria. And the company often dictates whether or not this is going to proceed or not. So it's kind of a similar deal. You make your claim to the company, this person needs this thing, it's emergent here, but they still want to make sure that their medicine doesn't cause harm. And I'll say that I've had frustrations down that path too. I've had successes down that path, but it's not always as quick as we would like. So if you truly need something emergently, it's tough to rely on those things. They can take some time.
Yeah.
And it's no guarantee it's going to go through. The company can just say, no, we don't offer that.
Right.
Yeah, it's tough. Those are options. They're things to discuss with providers, but I wouldn't assume that's going to go through. I would say the vast majority of patients are not on something like that. You'd have more luck finding a place that has a clinical trial and going there, which, to your point earlier, make sure you have to make sure you have all the correct screening. And if you're going to a clinical trial site, when you're progressing, then the screening starts then. And that's another big delay. But then if you add another treatment, well, you may not be a candidate for the trial because you're on another treatment now. So balancing those things is really, really hard. Even just finding where the trials exist is really, really hard. But I think Max, to the point you're making earlier about having trials here, and then I'm perpetually frustrated about the degree of regulatory burden in our trials. So the fact that you can go out of country, get it, and clearly derive benefit, I think speaks to the state of our clinical trial structure here right now. And if you ask me, I think it's academically great. It's probably the best academic setting for a trial, but that's different from, are you deriving the most information you can while doing the best good, or are you deriving the best information you can? And I think we derive the best information we can. I don't know if that distinction makes a lot of sense for those who are not running trials and seeing patients, but in my mind, a lot of the trial system is really generated in the ivory tower. And it takes a really creative person to try to go out of that framework and think, what are the things that we can do to really make sure we're more inclusive, we're helping more people? And then you have to kind of battle with the sponsors to make those concessions because it's more risk for them. That's a reality of that. But no, it's a struggled landscape for sure.
So, question to either of you, why is it on the patient to do this research? Why
Max, I think that's directed to you. If I could,
like,
I think she's looking at you.
Why? I don't know. To me, like, an oncologist is someone that's overseeing your care, and I don't understand. And maybe it just depends on the oncologist or what have you, and how involved they are. But I hear more and more that it's on the patient to do their own exploration. For me, it should be on the oncologist to do the research and find out what you might be eligible for. They should be making the phone calls peer to peer, doctor to doctor, to have these discussions to see if their patient is eligible or might be eligible. And so it's very confusing to me why it's on someone who is terminally ill, in this case, to find out a drug that might be applicable to them.
Yeah, I can kind of give, it comes off cynical, but this has been my experience, so I would definitely open to pushback. But so MSK is one of these ivory tower places, and still, I think I recently saw the statistic, maybe there's 3,000 plus trials recruiting in lung cancer right now. MSK only has 300. It's incredible. MD Anderson probably also. So our oncologist at MSK was super helpful in helping us find a trial within the MSK system. They had a built-in software that would match patients to trials within MSK. But there was no system that was able to help that oncologist search for trials outside of MSK. So where I kind of have the cynicism is, I think the oncologists want to find the right trial for the patient, but if they're seeing a patient in 20 minutes and they're seeing hundreds of patients, they do not have the time or bandwidth to search for trials outside of their institution. And the institution is designed in a way to keep patients continuing to get care at that institution. So I think there's some financial incentives at play, but ultimately there's this technical barrier where searching for a clinical trial on clinicaltrials.gov can take hours. And that's part of what I've been focused on improving since my mom's disease stabilized and she's been on this drug, through my patient advocacy work and helping other patients do clinical trial searches and having the engineering background. I've built a platform that tries to automate as much of that search as possible. So I see the solution as patient plus oncologist, because I think there can be different aspects brought to the table by both.
Yeah, when you said, this is cynical, I thought I was going to be much worse. No, I was bracing myself for something far more accusatory. Okay. No, I think what you're saying makes sense to me. That's my experience. When a patient is progressing and therefore they're a candidate for a trial, 2 days in advance of their appointment. That's, we get our scans fairly close to the appointment dates, or at least I try to have my appointment date quickly after a scan, because I know if there's progression, I want to act on it. I don't want to wait 3 weeks. So then I have 2 days, and they're not the only patient I'm seeing. That there's much to do and not a lot of time. And then when that appointment visit happens, as you said, there 15, 20 minutes to go through, make sure their symptoms are okay, understand what are the acute things. Sometimes progression doesn't lend itself to a trial. You need to act quickly. So, navigating these things, you have time to screen your internal trials. But when you type, Samantha, you've typed in HER2 in clinicaltrials.gov. Do you remember how many trials came up?
Yeah. I mean, hundreds, thousands.
Yeah, thousands, probably thousands of trials. So it's really, Max, to your point, it's really, really hard to go through. Now, I'll say that's true when there's an acute visit where you have to accomplish something that visit, which is most of my visits with my patients. It's a toxicity check. I'm reviewing labs. I'm making sure their symptoms are okay. Or they're progressing right now. And I need to say, here's what I can offer you right now. And, do you have time to look elsewhere? Do you not have time to look elsewhere? Do we need to act on this depending on the disease biology of the cancer? There are patients who will have an independent appointment that's not progressing, that's not, there's no other indication other than to say, let's look for some options for me for when that time comes. And that's actually a reason I love having second appointments or second opinions rather with me or wherever you are going to go when you're not progressing to get in the system. They have then all of your records, they have all the things. And then if a clinical trial is available at the point of progression, you're not waiting 3 weeks to come in to evaluate for a trial that you may or may not be a candidate for. But still, it requires you go somewhere, pay out of pocket for whatever isn't covered by insurance. Like there's tons of logistical barriers. So I think there's a lot that is in the way of the provider being able to handle this. And even from me, I'm going to look and find 10 trials one person might be a candidate for. I don't know that they're going to want to go there. Most people don't want to travel for clinical trials. So for me to do that ahead of time it would be truly impossible. You would probably need 2 full-time people for one physician's clinic. That's just their job, would be coordinating potential trials. And that's money that would be funded from something for people to enroll in other institutions. So you wouldn't be reimbursed for that. So I don't know who would pay that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of pragmatic factors that limit our ability to coordinate trials. But it's as much on the physician side. People are going to hear this; they're not going to believe me. But the physicians are very, very frustrated by how challenging it is to pair patients with promising trials. I can't tell you how many conversations I have in a given week. This person is not a trial candidate for our trial. I recommend these other standard of care things, and if they're interested in traveling to other places, let me know where and I can help. But it's really, really hard. But that's why we have people like Max who use their special nerd powers to generate solutions to these kinds of problems.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm curious, Max, did you, I know I'm a director of products, so I kind of geek out on this stuff, but did you create an AI kind of search engine or what did you do? Or if you don't want to share and it's proprietary, don't worry about it.
It's an open book. That's definitely the concept here. It's essentially what I was mimicking for my mom. I just tried to automate the software engineer in me. So I was pulling her electronic health records. I was pulling all the trials from clinicaltrials.gov. And then I was signing away my mom's data rights to Gemini or ChatGPT. No business associate agreement in place, no regard for HIPAA compliance. And once things stabilized and I had time, I was working at another job. I realized this is what I was meant to do, is to build this platform out for other patients. So it was really taking those different inputs and creating a platform where I could sign BAAs with the Geminis and ChatGPTs of the world. And for patients who don't know what a BAA is, it essentially means that I'm taking on the risk and of HIPAA compliance. So I'm ensuring that your data does not get sold to other institutions or pharmaceutical companies. That if you want to delete your data, I have software mechanisms in place that delete it from our logs. And even if I wanted to go and look at our databases, it's encrypted, so I couldn't see a patient's records. Coupling that with clinicaltrials.gov is such a mess to use, but it's actually very easy to access the data. So every day we copy over the entire ct.gov database, we enrich the data, and we look for certain characteristics about trials to make it very easy to search. So if a patient connects their electronic health records, we'll deduce they have an EGFR exon 20 mutation, they have a diagnosis, lung cancer, adenocarcinoma, they have certain grade toxicities, and we utilize all of those clinical trial relevant information and data points to then guide the search. So that list of 2,000 trials you're getting from HER2 now is a list of 10 to 20. And it's all relevant to your specific scenario as a patient. Are you a second line or third line patient? Are you treatment naive? So instead of the patient having to manually figure this all out, this is exactly what AI is going to have a huge impact on. But what I'm nervous about is that this technology is being rolled out within the institutions and it's almost being siloed between the hospitals. And there are some companies that are creating great trial matching technologies, but it's only being available for that specific hospital. So I want to put this technology into the hands of patients, be super transparent about data integrity and maintaining HIPAA compliance. And it's been quite the journey.
That's awesome. Could you take it as far as, like I have a list of, say, 5 trials that I'm keeping my eyes on for when the time comes. Is it a software where people can come to you and say, like, I have these 5 trials I've identified, which one might be a better fit based off my charts kind of thing? Does it go as far as that?
Yeah, and I'd even say a step further where these trials are being updated every day. So maybe it goes from not yet recruiting to recruiting, or they open up a new site in your location. We're working on alert systems so that if trial is relevant to you, you get alerted that it's now recruiting in your area.
Gotcha.
So definitely helping I think another big component, and this is what providers I think do well, is if you have the right list of 5 trials, how does the patient decide which one to go on? The patient might be concerned about, is it inpatient or outpatient? Can I still work while on the trial? What's the timing commitment? Am I going to lose my hair? There's so many questions that are that overlap between patients. And that's where I think AI and also just better access to the trials details for the providers can better answer those questions for patients, because such a small % of patients ever get onto a promising trial. And after reaping the benefits personally, it's really important to me that we improve that.
Well, I think from a provider perspective, I think this kind of technology would really revolutionize how we do things. You know, what you're describing is my dream for my patients. When I don't have a clinical trial next option and they showed up with a list of 5, I can go through and say, oh, the data for this one's really good. You know, this one is every week. Just keep that in mind. You know, I can counsel, but the time it would take to curate that list of 5 based on clinicaltrials.gov would be tens to hundreds of hours. It would be way, way, way too long. So it's not feasible. So I think putting this in patients' hands also incentivizes the healthcare groups So if a patient calls us and says, hey, I think I'm a candidate for your trial, I used this resource, it says I screened positive, would you mind looking at my records and confirming? I think that's a much easier ask to say, I'd like to enroll care there. Can you help me do that? Rather than, please please you do the many hours worth of work, comb through my files, and then I can't come there eventually anyway. So I think it's an absolutely great use of AI. Remind me what the platform is called. And
It's called Patient Data Vault, and it's right now in beta testing. So it's really important to me that right now I know every patient's name who's using the tool. They can call me directly. It's not, I'm structuring it to not be considered medical advice, but when you throw AI into someone's hands, it's really hard to just say, to have the guardrails in place for them not to perceive it that way. So that aspect is really important to me. And I think ultimately building trust is my differentiator, as so many other companies are building out these types of solutions and trying to monetize it. And I'm really focused on partnering with patient advocacy groups where I've benefited tremendously from them. And I think they're a great launching pad for this product. So it's called Patient Data Vault. Name is in progress. We could maybe come up with a better one on the podcast or following this if you have any ideas. But security and trust were the kind of main aspects I was trying to emphasize.
Yeah. And I mean, again, I think the premise, great premise, we can't come out and formally endorse other parties' things, but I think these kinds of solutions to complicated problems where there are so many clinical trials out there that one could potentially benefit from, and finding the needle in that haystack is completely incredibly challenging to do. But to your mom's story, it's the difference between life and death. And I think having a tool that connects the dots that are right here in front of us is so lacking, and it's such a clear need that everyone benefits from. So I think I commend you for your work on it. I don't think people appreciate maybe just how much of an uphill battle that is. Institutions will probably not be terribly eager to use it from their perspective due to liability issues. If there ever were a data leak, they can get sued for millions, even though you have all the correct protections in place. You can do everything right. So I think coming at it from a patient perspective and putting the power in the patient's hands makes all the sense in the world to me. And it's probably how it should be anyway, as long as it's not such a huge time commitment on the patient to try to find these solutions, but rather equipping them with some options that they can discuss with their provider.
Exactly. It's my journey through patient advocacy. It's about patient empowerment, and technology is the greatest equalizer. And in the healthcare, there are barriers that have been put in place to reduce technical innovation. So I'm sure there are many people like me who want to have an impact, and that's what's been so encouraging. Meeting those types of individuals, meeting with the providers. And it is a massive uphill battle, but it requires patience and precision.
Samantha, what are your, initial thoughts based on that kind of tool, this development, and how maybe clinical trials are eventually accessed?
I'm super excited about it. I use AI every hour in my job, and it helps make fantastic decisions for me without having to think. And in my opinion, there's so much stress and pressure put on us as stage 4 patients that if we have a tool that allows us to maybe not think as much and something else can think for us, while obviously we as people are still providing input and expertise, having something do the bulk of the legwork for you, I think is massive. So I'm a big proponent of it. And I love that, Max, you kind of prefaced about, because I've seen a lot of people where they'll put like their CT write-ups or their PET scan write-ups or whatever in ChatGPT, and it will like respond in such a, almost put like a positive spin on things, even when they're bad scans. And so I think putting those guardrails up and kind of education pieces of like, this is the tool, this is what it's meant for, and just be aware of these things, I think, and the parameters, I think, is really important and good that you're aware of that. Because not everyone is who isn't in this field on a regular basis. They just think whatever AI is saying is fact. And that can be a little worrying sometimes.
Exactly. Like, I think AI, it's amazing when I connect with patients who use AI. That's like the best input to me, because the reason I'm working so hard on this and not just letting ChatGPT, they announced a partnership with a company to integrate medical records into their platform, is because individual people, I think, can focus on the action layer. So you can get an informational response from ChatGPT, but how do you help someone get onto a clinical trial?
Right.
And that action layer requires meeting with individual patients and going through user journeys. And I think that's a really exciting step we're going to be taking as an industry in the coming years.
Yeah, and I think maybe just to kind of close this out, Max, could you for one more time, mention the tool and a line or two about what you would want people to take away from it?
Yeah, of course. So it's called Patient Data Vault because I want patients to be the center of it. I want patients to know that their data is secure so they can sleep at night, and that financial incentives are in the patient's favor. This is currently being funded. It's not venture backed. I'm doing this purely because I believe it will be better for all of us as a patient community for a tool like this to exist and be in patient hands. And I'm an active member in a lot of different Facebook groups, and we'll probably start appealing to more patients in those groups, because I think just as a community, as patients, we need to stand up for ourselves. And that's what this tool is, the purpose.
Yeah, and echoing on your sentiment there, I think one thing that we've tried to accomplish with this podcast forum is, I think, the intellectual gap, the knowledge gap between patients, providers, those in the oncosphere and those not in the oncosphere, is getting smaller and smaller. I think everyone can make a difference. Everyone can champion their own health. And this was actually something you mentioned, the podcast with Dr. Ross Camage that we had on not too long ago, about him getting diagnosed with his own cancer. And he mentioned that, in a couple months, that's really all it takes for you to become a true expert in your disease. And with the information we have now, people should feel empowered that they, with the skills in hand at your fingertips through, AI tools, other publicly available data sets, you can do this. You can make these big changes, and you're not alone when you're trying. Max, I think you're doing a great thing, and I've seen the amount of patient support behind you. So I think there are good things to come.
Thank you.
All right, Samantha, any last words before we log off?
Nope. Just thank you, Max, for joining us. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
No, thanks for being here. This is Cracking Cancer, the podcast. You can go to crackingcancer.org to read more and learn more about what's going on. All right, bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Cracking Cancer. If you found this helpful, please like, subscribe, leave us a review, and visit crackingcancer.org for more information. Every dollar we earn goes directly to furthering the podcast and supporting vital cancer research, because together we can crack cancer.